Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are returning to September 2007 and taking a look at what to me was the most frustrating deck to play against, anti-meta macro-based strategies. At this time, there were several avenues that you could take in order to incorporate Macrocosmos into your deck. Some of the versions that saw success played Macrocosmos, D-Figure, DD Survivor, and Monarchs like Rise of the Storm Monarch. Others incorporated Survivor, Macrocosmos, and D-Fissure with an Elemental Hero package. Hugo Adem was able to topple YCS or an SJC at the time with a small monster lineup incorporating Elemental Hero, Wildheart, plus Stratos. I've elected today to incorporate a monster lineup that does elect to run Monarchs like Rise of the Storm Monarch. I think that was such a prominent feature of the format, and to me that was the most common version of this deck, but I will allude to the other versions during the deck profile. For me, in order to understand why macro-based strategies were so good, it's important to look at some of the top decks at the time. We've already profiled Card of Safe Return Zombie, which obviously if you don't have access to your graveyard, is going to be significantly stymied with cards like Card of Safe Return, Book of Light, Call of the Haunted, Zombie Master, Illblood, the list goes on. Then, of course, you're going to take a look at Light and Darkness Dragon-based D-Hero strategies. Of course, if you're unable to access the graveyard, Light and Darkness Dragon is weaker. The inability to revive Disc Commander is a big issue. Obviously, the deck has Fearmonger, Call of the Haunted, Premature, Malicious. Again, the list goes on. Any strategy that really relied on Treeborn Frog, there were sort of more traditional Monarch decks at the time. Even if you didn't play Light and Darkness Dragon, as a matter of fact, you could go and just play a more traditional Perfect Circle deck and have Zaborg over Light and Darkness Dragon and still be vulnerable to this strategy. So to me, this was by far one of the most difficult decks to play against because in addition to the reality that it was such a good anti-meta deck with what we now traditionally call floodgates, D-Fissure and Macro, it was also a deck that pressured your life points. During this format, and we've already profiled it, the other anti-meta, or at least heavy trap deck at the time, at least if we put aside things like gadgets, would have been the Comic Odyssey Burn deck, a deck that we've already profiled. To me, I'd much rather play against Comic Odyssey Burn because, yes, there were ways in which that deck can put damage on the board quickly. You know, if they have an aggressive start with Card Trooper and Breaker and you don't actually have any monsters, that chip damage can be frustrating. Yes, the countdown of Wave Motion Cannon can be ominous. But besides that, there's not a ton of different burn outlets besides attacking into things like Dimension Wall. And as a result, playing against that deck to me is a little bit easier because if you play against it a lot, you can start to pinpoint a reality, which is if you hold off on Heavy Storm, MST, Wing Blast, Dust Tornado, your spell and trap card removal, and try to overload the opponent all in one turn, you can often break their spell and trap cards, establish a board, and actually win the game. And the opportunity for that to happen is a byproduct of having multiple turns and being willing to pass back and forth as they sit there with skill drain and a bunch of back rows. You know, if you just leave D-Wall on their back row, it's going to clog their back row, and that limits the amount of counter traps that they can have when you actually start to activate your spell and trap destruction. That's not the case with this DD Survivor-based deck. This deck has an 1800 beat stick that's impossible to destroy when you have Macrocosmos and D-Fissure, at least permanently. You can do it for that turn. This deck is summoning Rise of the Storm Monarch and pressuring your life points that way. This deck also has all of those counter traps, so you're still motivated to try and overload the back row, but you just simply don't have the time to do so because this deck can just beat you down, which to me made this a much more frustrating deck to play against than the skill drain based decks that we've already profiled. But nevertheless, we're going to take our first deep dive look at anti-meta Macrocosmo based strategies, specifically one that's electing to run Rise of the Storm Monarch as opposed to the E-Hero package. All right, we'll start the deck profile off with the most important monster, which is DD Survivor. So DD Survivor is our primary tribute fodder for Ryza. When it is banished through either D-Fissure or Macrocosmos, it allows you to special summon it back during the end phase. You can have multiple copies going, so in addition to being tribute fodder, it can be really difficult to push through because it's always going to be providing you field presence. It can be very frustrating to play against when your opponent has D-Fissure or Macro. It basically renders all of your removal relatively worthless. You know, if you're attacking the Mirror Force and you have D-Fissure out, it's basically just protecting life points. It's acting almost as a threatening roar because DD Survivor is just going to come back during the end phase. So it can be incredibly frustrating to deal with. And as the game goes on, your opponent will eventually draw into multiple copies. So it'll eventually get to a point in time where you have multiple copies of DD Survivor going. And DD Survivor can be special summoned during the end phase in defense mode, which means if you tribute it off and your opponent deals with a Monarch, you can just summon this in defense mode if your opponent has a Cyber Dragon or a big monster. And even though the defense is really low, you're not risking taking damage by putting it in attack mode. So you could have 2-3 DD Survivors going, just keep bringing them back in defense mode and wall up against opponents, prolonging the game, stalling things out, and waiting until you draw into some removal yourself. So DD Survivor is just a critical card. In order to beat this deck, you really need to pinpoint a turn where you can deal with Macro or D-Fissure or even multiple copies, which is way easier said than done in a deck that has 3 Solemn Judgments and 3 Dark Bribes, plus 6 copies of either Macro or D-Fissure, so it is way easier said than done. But try and pinpoint a turn where you can deal with that and then attack over these so they actually go to the graveyard so you can stop that stream of card advantage. But as I said now twice, that is so much easier said than done. In reality, it can be very difficult to actually pinpoint that turn, but that is one of the things that you are trying to do against this deck. As I mentioned, DD Survivor is perfect tribute fodder for Ryza when it is being banished. When it's not being banished, it's not that great. But when you are tributing DD Survivor, you're getting it back during the end phase. It's a floater at that point. Your opponent eventually deals with it and just comes back again. Getting to tribute for Ryza is absolutely crazy. Ryza is by far the best Monarch at this point in time. Caius is not yet out, and triple Ryza slots in perfectly. It can hit back rows. You can spin Wave Motion Cannons to the top of the opponent's deck, reset their draw phases, card of safe return. We've talked about Ryza now in multiple deck profiles from this format, and it is by far the best Monarch. It would actually be limited to 1 at the end of this particular format, heading into Dark Arm Dragon format. So 3 copies of Ryza. Then some of the support monsters. So the Ryzas weren't actually staple in this deck. As I commented on in the introduction, there are a few different versions of this deck. One that had Stratos and Wildheart as the supporting cast to the Survivor package. Others that looked more like this that had Monarchs. I think the Monarch build's a little bit better personally. So I have the 3 Ryzas. 2 copies of Banisher of the Radiance gives us sort of a 7th and 8th copy of what Macro and D-Fissure supply. Banisher of the Radiance needs a little bit of help in order to stick around on the field, so we are going to play cards like Enemy Controller. There's not a ton of defensive cards, though, so I could understand maybe cutting the Banisher of the Radiances, but it does give you an additional copy of D-Fissure and Macrocosmos, making it so that you basically always open at least D-Fissure, Macro, or Banisher, right? You have 8 copies in a 40-card deck. Chances are you're going to open 1. So we have 2 copies of Banisher of the Radiance. Then we have 2 copies of Exiled Force. Exiled Force was played because this deck's going to run Reinforcements of the Army in order to access DD Survivor. That also allows us to then access a removal card with Reinforcements of the Army. So having 2 Exiled Forces give us essentially 4 copies of Exiled Force with the 2 Rotas, but give us access to that 1-for-1 removal. This deck can sometimes have a bit of difficulty dealing with big monsters. We have plenty of cards in the deck to worry about that, but if our opponent sticks a Monarch and we top deck Rota, we want to be able just to get Exile Force and kill the Monarch. In addition to that, and I've commented on this in some of the deck choices I made in other decks, monsters like Spy and Legendary Jujutsu Master can be a bit of a problem. So if we just have access to Exile Force, we can kill those monsters without ever having to triggering their effects. So double Exile Force gives us a little bit of a removal package, sort of a small warrior toolbox package. I think Breaker is just a generically good card. It doesn't necessarily do anything unique to this deck that warrants its inclusion in the sense that we don't care about our opponent's D-Fissures and Macrocosmoses, but this is a format where it's great to pick off Wing Blast before setting D-Fissure and Macrocosmos or activating Fissure/setting Macrocosmos. So you can imagine a game where you're playing against the Light and Darkness Dragon D-Rida decks or just Perfect Circle, summoning this turn 1, targeting their Wing Blast, and now they can choose to Wing Blast this, which might not be great, and if they do, you're free to play D-Fissure and Macro, so that's great. If your opponent doesn't have Skill Drain, it obviously puts in work against the Skill Drain burn decks. It can help pinpoint some of the stall cards out of Baboon Burn, so I think Breaker's just a great card, so I'm going to include it in my deck. There's a copy of Morphing Jar, which wasn't included in all these decks, but I think this deck, it really warrants a spot because the monster lineup's so small, and you have so many counter traps, you can actually end up putting together a game state where Morphing Jar resolves, which is just absolutely incredible. So Morphing Jar, and then 1 copy of DD's Scout Plane. The thing with DD's Scout Plane is it allows you to play Gold Sarcophagus if you have access to it, which Hugo Adem, who was a really well-known player on Comic Odyssey, did. It makes it so that when you Gold Sarc DD Scout Plane, it actually comes back during the end phase. It comes back in attack mode, so it actually has a little bit of a downside in comparison to DD Survivor, but this functions basically as your 4th copy of DD Survivor. You do have to be careful about this. You don't have the option to not bring it back. So if you do get into a point in time, your opponent can actually consistently attack over DD Survivor, or rather DD Scout Plane, because it has to come back in attack mode. And that can be a little bit of an issue because your opponent could actually be staring at the DD Survivors and say, that's fine. My game plan is to attack over the Scout Plane every turn for damage. And you don't really have the choice of not bringing it back or anything. It can eventually get into a point in time where you bring it back on your turn and just put it to defense mode. And if your opponent deals with it on your turn, that's really the issue, or you choose to tribute for a Monarch. Otherwise, it does kind of contribute to that walling effect, right? If you constantly get it back into defense mode on your turn because your opponent attacked over it once, you can sort of avoid that issue, but it is something to note. You don't have an option. So if your opponent plays Torrential or they have a way of dealing with this, on your turn, and then during the end phase transitioning into their turn, it comes back in attack mode, you could lose a game you don't anticipate losing, and when you play triple Solemn Judgment, your life points might be lower than you anticipate, but it does give us access to a good Gold Sark target. I will also point out, if you wanted to, you could probably reconfigure the monster lineup to play Crush Card Virus. This is a Crush Card target, and one version of this deck had Spies in it, and if you play Spy, then you can play Guard, and then you could bump up the Crush Card targets between DD Scout Planes and Guards, and then Gold Sark actually functions as a target because it can tutor out the DD Scout Plane. I've elected not to include Crush Card Virus because I'm not even necessarily positive that that version of the deck is better, because you're warping quite a lot of your deck to play it, but that's a decision that you can make into something I did want to point out. But I think one Scout Plane is interesting because Hugo got to play Gold Sarcophagus, and in at least one of the versions when he did, he played the Scout Plane. So a little bit of an interesting choice. You could cut the Scout Plane. I don't think it's absolutely essential. Between DD Survivor and 2 reinforcements of the army, you usually have access to that floating banished effect, but it's not necessarily always a guarantee. So having basically a 6th copy is what that DD Scout Plane serves. Then for the spells, we have 3 copies of Dimensional Fissure. We absolutely need access to it, so we do need to max it out. Some people cut back on Macrocosmos, but Defissure was the one that you kept at 3, which from a modern Yu-Gi-Oh perspective might be interesting because Macro, the ability to flip it, the ability to set it, and sort of pinpoint when you need to activate it might seem better. But in this particular format, we kind of just want to play this and then normal summon DD Survivor and have that banish effect active from the moment our turn begins, as opposed to waiting till our opponent's turn. So if you did want to cut back on either Defissure or Macro, it would actually be Macro that you cut back on. But 3 copies of Defissure. Already mentioned 2 copies of Reinforcements of the Army. Now we have access to more copies of DD Survivor. We can tutor out Exile Force if we need it, so it gives us a little bit of flexibility there. Some versions of this deck play DD Assailant, but I think that was a bit of an antiquated idea. I understand that it's a Rota target, but we're not playing a Banish theme deck, right? Our purpose of playing these cards is to counteract the meta, but generate card advantage, and DD Assailant doesn't really do any of that. It's just a beat stick that I don't actually think is any good. So 2 Reinforcements of the Army with Exiled as the removal, not DD Assailant, or DD Warrior Lady for that matter, plus DD Survivor. That's plenty. We have 2 copies of Soul Taker. Soul Taker was incredibly expensive, and not only expensive, really difficult to find as a glass secret rare. I can understand if you just play Smashing Grounds because that is a common in IOC, very easily accessible. I think if you were going to play a pair of removal cards, which a lot of these decks did, I think it makes sense to play Soul Taker because I think it is strictly better than Smashing Ground. However, they were incredibly expensive. But again, I'm showing this deck with a prize card, so I can understand playing Soul Taker. But you could easily switch these out for Smashing Grounds, which you will see in a lot of decks. Then we have a couple copies of Enemy Controller. So this deck's, again, only running 3 Monarchs and a playset of Rises. But Enemy Controller serves 2 functions. One, this deck does have a problem dealing with big monsters, which is why we have Soul Taker in the deck in the first place. But we can shift something to defense and attack over it, usually with DD Survivors. That's pretty good. It's a chainable. I already commented on that when I did the D-Rata profile, where it gives you some flexibility against Light and Darkness Dragon. In addition to that, you can tribute your DD Survivor. It'll come back during the end phase, take control of one of your opponent's monsters, and then tribute for Ryza. That's sort of one of the perfect plays when you get to tribute a monster that's a floater in DD Survivor with one of these on the field, and then get to tribute for a Monarch. That's the perfect case scenario, which means it does a few different things. 1, it can be defensive, but then 2, it can combo really well with Monarchs, and 3, it actually gives us some defense in terms of keeping Banisher the Radiance alive. As you'll see, this trap lineup that we're about to talk about doesn't have a lot of defensive cards. It's not jamming Bottomless and Sakuratsu armors, per se, and Enemy Controller instead slots in as that defensive card. Next, we have a single copy of MST. We're not going to play Heavy Storm. Our deck has too many traps in it, but this card is useful. It's useful in the mirror match, not to pick off Defissure or Macro. We don't really care about them, but picking off their other back rows, right? You kind of want to pinpoint their Solemn Judgments. We can hit Wing Blast preemptively, so we don't have to worry about them spinning these back. It functions really well. Also, Comic Odyssey Burn is a deck. Baboon Burn is a deck. There are a bunch of decks where there's just a ton of back rows. There was actually a version of Little City during this format, so we have to worry about hitting back rows in several different formats. So MST is great. We have 1 copy of Brain Control. I can understand cutting Brain Control. It's similar to Enemy Controller, but again, doesn't have that defensive aspect to it. But you do need to win the game eventually, and this card can swing the game in your favor. Ryza is also a great combo with Brain Control, but I can understand you cutting this. This deck with only 3 Monarchs isn't pushing it to 5 or 6 like some versions of this deck did. But I think Brain Control is just such a powerful card. It's still warranted. Games last long enough. It's not a one-turn game, so you're going to be able to see the top 15, 16, 17 cards of your deck. So if you see Brain, you probably got to see a Ryza too. And if you don't, you could probably find a way of winning the game by doing one big push. Plus your deck has Dark Bribe and Solemn, so your big pushes are usually backed by counter traps. So if you can activate Brain Control to win, you usually can protect it too. Then we have one copy of Gold Sark. It is a prize card. We've had this discussion a few times. In this deck, you are typically searching out DD Scout Plane if you need access to a monster, or you're searching out just sort of a power card. I could see you warping the deck for Crush Card Virus such that you end up playing this to access Crush Card Virus as well. So that's a decision that you can make. Otherwise, we're using it to be able to tutor out Scout Plane. In fact, it's just a good card. What else would you be searching? Maybe Ryza. Having access to Ryza is great. Maybe access to a Reinforcement of the Army is great. That way, you still have the ability to draw into your Rhoda targets, but maybe you need removal, so you possibly could search out Exiled Force or DD Survivor on the turn that follows, depending on what you actually need once a couple more draw phases happen. You could search, it might seem odd, but Mirror Force, Torrential, Solemn Judgment, just some of your more powerful cards. In terms of the trap lineup, this is really what made this deck such a pain to play against. I like the triple Pulling the Rug deck, meaning not every version of this deck played it, but I loved Pulling the Rug in the main deck in this deck because in order to play against this deck, you sort of need to try and pinpoint, okay, I'm going to finally get this Rise Attribute off. It's going to spin their Defissurer macro, and then I'll be able to use my graveyard. But no. With triple Pulling the Rug, you are never resolving a Monarch against this deck between this and then 3 copies of Solemn Judgment. It's just never happening. Pulling the Rug did something against basically everything. It worked against Gadgets, which was a top tier deck at the time. It worked against the Searchers and Demise, which was at least a rogue deck at the time that you had to worry about. It functioned in the mirror match by hitting your opponent's Ryza. Unbelievable against Light and Darkness Dragon-based Monarch decks. With Perfect Circle Engine, because it hits Stratos and it hits the Ryzes. It technically hits Breaker too. So Pulling the Rug hits so many things out of basically every single deck. It might seem like a bit of a narrow card, but because it overlaps with so many decks, I think it's worthwhile. Even decks like Baboon Burn played Ryza, so triple Pulling the Rug makes a lot of sense. I already commented on Triple Judgment. We are protecting our continuous spell and trap, so absolutely pivotal. We want to set a bunch of acros, which is also why we are running 3 copies of Dark Bribe. This 6 counter trap engine was something that we already talked about in Comic Odyssey Burn, but again, here in this macro-based deck, a very similar idea. We're going to play a bunch of counter traps to back up our continuous cards. And then we have 3 copies of Macro Cosmos. So I like the full 3 macro, 3D fissure package. One of the reasons to cut back on Macro Cosmos is actually to open up the ability to transition side. If you have 3 macros, it becomes a little bit more difficult to transition side. I'll talk about that in a few moments, but we're going to go 3 copies of Macro, and then just sort of some power one-ups. You have 1 copy of Mirror Force, 1 copy of Torrential, and then Dust Shoot's legal, so I'm a huge advocate of Dust Shoot in any format that it's legal. So we're going to absolutely play that single copy of Dust Shoot as well. The only trap that is, I'll say missing, but the only thing that you could consider, again, as I commented on, is considering running Crush Card Virus. If you run Crush Card Virus, you might need to either bump up the DD Scout Planes, or even just run the 1, which is fine too, because you have the Gold Sarcophagus. But bump up DD Scout Plane, maybe find room for Reaper, or maybe find room for the Gravekeeper Spy package, which some of these decks just naturally played anyway. Then if you play the Spy package, you'd want to play a Guard because it is a Crush Card target. That's a decision that you can make, but as of now, I'm profiling this deck without Crush Card. But that is our main deck. So in terms of what we could anticipate playing against, there is, of course, D-Rida decks. We've already commented on Light and Darkness Dragon-based decks. They were easily the most popular deck at the time. One of your best matchups, but they were definitely a popular deck, so we will keep them in the back of our mind. There was, of course, the Mirror Match. There was Demise-based decks. We talked about older versions of Demise. That's similar. I commented on this in a recent video. Just different ways of OTKing with things like Swing of Memories, but still a Demise-based deck. We have Wave Motion Cannon. We have Gadgets. When Wave Motion Cannon, I'm referring to Comic Odyssey Burn. Gadget decks. We have Perfect Circle without Light and Darkness Dragon. We have Card to Save Return decks. And then we have Panda Burn decks. So those are the ones that we are worried about. Which then brings us to how are we side decking? So one thing to take a note of is if you go back and look at Macro Cosmos-based decks, there is really 2 differing opinions in terms of how we should side deck. If you look at some of the decks that Hugo Adem built, who is the player I referred to earlier from Comic Odyssey, his side decks in the 2 events that he used this particular deck, macro-based decks, one with Monarchs, one with Elemental Heroes, he was a fan of transition sides. meaning you side into a completely different strategy. You actually side 15 cards out, meaning you side out all of the Macrocosmos, all of the D-Fissures, you side out maybe the DD Survivors, depending on the matchup. You side out just a bunch of the engine cards, and you keep in, you know, the generically powerful cards in your deck, like, let's say, Solemn Judgment, you keep in Mirror Force, you keep in those cards, but you decide out the very specific banished cards, right? The cards that are dependent on getting things banished. And then you side in 15 engine cards from a totally different strategy. He was a fan of Cyber Beatdown, or Machine Beatdown. So I'm talking about siding in Cyber Phoenixes, Cyber Dragons, a limiter removal, cards like that. The other version of this deck that you would look for is one that sided into Monarchs. Some actually were able to side fully into Perfect Circle Monarchs, or just a generic Monarch deck, right? You're already playing Rises, and if you actually look at the strict engine, so cards that are just completely engine-based, and if we are siding out our strategy entirely, how many cards that lines up to be, well, you'll actually see that it is basically perfectly 15, with a few cards that we're not in love with, but it's still pretty good. So if we just totally side out the engine cards, what does that end up looking like? So we have one macro. I do not have 4 super macros. So the macro from the main deck is right here, but this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, which means you have to continue main decking Reinforcements of the Army for just 2 Exile Forces, which isn't the greatest thing in the world. Exile Forces in and of itself isn't great. You also need to main deck Pulling the Rug still, which, depending on the matchup, could be a little bit of a liability. But besides that, the rest of the deck is relatively functional. It is just a collection of decent Yu-Gi-Oh cards, which then means if you put in 15 cards from a Destiny Hero Monarch deck, that would be functional. 15 cards from a Machine Beatdown deck, that would be functional. And when they side in MSTs, Dust Tornadoes, Mobiuses, you can kind of catch them off guard by not having the the D-Fissure, DD Survivor macro package in. Personally, not a fan. I found, even after, in some cases, overcompensating with my side deck in some matchups, that I still had difficulty playing against a deck that has 6 counter traps and triple dark, actually 9 counter traps, quite frankly, between 3 Dark Bribe, 3 Pulling the Rug, and 3 Solemn Judgment. I'm sticking with the macro package, games 2 and 3. And instead, I'm putting together a side deck that tries to counteract what I anticipate in the meta. So for me, I liked a side deck that looked something more like this, which is triple Mobius. We have the ability to conduct tribute summons. We can even side out Rise if we feel like that's too many. But I really liked Mobius because in a couple matchups, it was just critical. Against Gadgets, it was really important. Against Panda Burn, it was really important. Against Comic Odyssey Burn, it was really important. If you play against the card a Safe Return deck, it ends up being really useful. So triple Mobius. I liked having a defensive card like Spy when I sided in additional cards like Mobius. It clogs the field. It counteracts the mirror match really well because of the big defense versus DD Survivor. It counteracts Gadgets flawlessly because of the big defense. Gives you tribute fodder by summoning a second Gravekeeper Spy. Just a fantastic card. So if we're not going to main them, which again, some of these decks did, I'm definitely going to side them. I wasn't a huge fan of this card, but I've yet to profile it in this format, and I think it's worth pointing out that Master of Barriers was actually a pretty common side deck choice against Comic Odyssey Burn. It's a monster that actually goes under Skill Drain. The effect is you tribute it and then destroy a face-up continuous spell or trap card, which means this can kill Wave Motion Cannon when it gets close, Messenger of Peace, Level Limit Area B, it can actually kill Skill Drain. So it's actually a monster out to Skill Drain that's also just a beat stick at 1700. So instead of a Dust Tornado per se, or some of those other types of cards that are one-sided in the sense that they are only spell and trap removal, this actually functions as a monster that you can attack with as well. I've yet to profile it in this format, and it was actually a pretty common side deck choice, so I've decided to put a couple here as an out to the Wave Motion Cannon-based Skill Drain decks. A couple Lightning Vortexes as a card against some of the matchups where the field can get clogged, like the Zombie matchup, for example, can get a little clogged. Even though you have cards like D-Fissure and Macro, a lot of people did elect to put Lightning Vortex rather, in their either main or side deck. If you play DD Scalplan, it actually gives you an out of discarding DD Scalplan and getting the effect too. Then I'm putting a Heavy Storm here just because it's such a powerful card. If you're playing against a mirror match, you're going to side deck out your own Macro and D-Fissures, and then the match basically becomes a battle of back rows against each other, particularly a lot of counter traps. I like a card like Heavy Storm because if you bait out cards like Dark Bribe and Solemn Judgment with monster effects or just other effects in general, you can end up using Heavy Storm and then destroying all their back rows. You're not baiting out Dark Bribe with monster effects, but definitely Solemn Judgment. So I love how a card like Heavy Storm, also a format with a lot of back row decks. Baboon Burn, Comic Odyssey burn, so Heavy Storm makes a lot of sense. That's also why I'm putting in a couple Dust Tornadoes. As you can see, I was a huge fan of siding a ton of back row removal because I just felt like so much of this format revolved around some really powerful continuous spells and traps. Wave Motion Cannon, Messenger of Peace, Skill Drain, Macro, and Defissure and other decks. Baboon Burn had stall cards like Level Limit, so I'm really overcompensating. I don't want to lose to pseudo floodgates like Level Limit. Last two cards is just a pair of Threatening Roars. I felt like this deck had space for something that was unique to the Demise deck. These could be Wabakus too. It could even be a 1-in-1 split. You know, if there are cards that are redundant, you're afraid of something like Mind Crush, you could go 1-in-1 split, but nobody's really playing Mind Crush, nor would you side it against this deck. But a couple pair of Threatening Roars, could be a Wabaku and a Threatening Roar too, but I feel like this side does a little bit of a better job. I don't think you have to worry about your opponent siding in a bunch of back row removal. You know, your Macro and Defissure are going to slow your opponent down, and this isn't one of those formats where it's combo-based, where, oh no, they got rid of my Floodgate, I just lose. They're going to go and special summon 85 times and put up 35 negations. In this format, your opponent clears Defissure and Macro. Like, okay, they get to de-draw Discommander and Premature it. They've been wanting to do that forever. They finally get to do it. And then if they don't win, which they're not likely going to be able to do, on the next turn you just play another Defissure or Macro, and then they're right back under the lock. So to me, you don't really need to play a transition side if your engine is so powerful and counter so much of the format flawlessly anyway. But nevertheless, that's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History, taking our deep dive look at Macro Cosmos-based Monarch decks. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.